War is, and so far as we know from history and tradition, has always been the pleasure and passion of the Indian. With or without cause, tribes occupying lands adjacent to each other were almost constantly on the warpath. So long as a tribe was surrounded closely by powerful and warlike neighbors, it remained intact, keeping in large villages and under control of one chief. When those neighbors were driven off, or through their own successes elsewhere, moved away, and the tribal territory became greatly extended, the tribe broke up into bands for the more easy and convenient supply of food. This was the opportunity of the ambitious sub-chiefs, leaders of bands, who, preferring to be chiefs of small bands rather than sub-chiefs of large ones, took every care to prevent any subsequent concentration except when forced to it by war, or by the imperative demand of the medicine chief, the supreme expounder of religious doctrine and dogma. At this moment, there are no less than 66 bands of Utes, separated widely in localities and speaking languages undoubtedly referable to one root, but so various as to dialect that any but the closest observer might with reason insist that they are different languages. So also, there are 34 different bands of Sioux, which were rapidly undergoing the same process of disintegration of language until the government unwittingly stopped it by concentrating these Indians on reservations. There are 19 bands of Shoshones or Snakes, 2 bands of which, wandering eastward over the Rocky Mountains, became entirely estranged from the parent tribe and are now known as Bannocks, having lost even their tribal name. They cannot speak or understand a word of their mother tongue. There are 28 bands of Apaches, speaking dialects of the same language and undoubtedly offshoots from the same parent stock. Yet, before they were conquered and placed on reservations, they waged incessant war with each other, and no tribes on this continent were more bitterly and uncompromisingly hostile than were these bands of the same tribe, one to the other. The Apaches were strong in numbers, warlike in spirit, crafty and energetic in action, and occupied a country almost inaccessible to whites. But for this internecine strife, it would have cost the United States government many years of bloody and expensive war to have subdued them. It will thus be seen that his own warlike temperament and disposition to roam have been to the Indian the cause, fruitful as Babel, of the confusion of tongues. There are other causes which may not have been without effect to add to this confusion. The indisposition or inability of the Plains Indians to learn a spoken language other than their own undoubtedly led to the adoption of the sign language as a medium of communication, and the knowledge of this, reacting forever, precluded the necessity of learning any oral language. For 60 years, the Cheyennes and Arapahoes have been the firmest friends, occupying the same country, living in the same camps, making peace or war with the same enemies at the same time, and conducting themselves in everything, except intermarriages, as if they were one and the same tribe. The children play, fight, hunt, and constantly associate together, yet not 1 in 10 of the men, women, or children of either tribe can hold even the most ordinary conversation in the language of the other. What makes this fact yet more remarkable is that while one language is comparatively easy, the other is so exceedingly difficult that even the best interpreters are forced to resort to sign language. Under these most exceptional circumstances, it would seem inevitable that the easy language would in time become the common means of communication of the two tribes. Such, however, is not the case. Each tribe uses its own language to communicate with its own people, and the sign language to communicate with the people of the other tribe. When the white trader invaded the solitudes of the Indian, He took with him, or soon picked up, a small stock of words, which, by his constant use among the tribes, have become, as it were, common property. Thus, squaw, the Narragansett name for woman, the Algonquin papoose for child, chuck, food, and many other words have become universal among all the North American Indians east of the Rocky Mountains when speaking to a white man or an Indian not of their own tribe. The multitude of languages is a peculiarity of savage life. Let the student remember the condition, in this respect, of Northern and Western Europe, even as late as the time of Julius Caesar, of Africa and South America at the present day, and without intending to be facetious, and with the desire simply to call attention to the tenacity with which barbarous peculiarities of language hold their grip on human nature, of England, Scotland, and Wales, through which, even in this enlightened age, an American can scarcely travel satisfactorily to himself without an interpreter. As in all other matters, where mere guesswork forms the basis of argument, authorities differ extremely as to the probable Indian population of the country now known as the United States at the time of its first settlement by whites, these estimates varying from 300,000 to 3 million. Basing my guess on the knowledge of the warlike disposition of the Indians, of their natural tendency constantly to split into bands, which possibly soon become fiercely hostile to each other, of the wide extent of territory required by each tribe, not only for its food supply, but for its safety, and of the almost universal lack of fecundity of their women, I am of opinion that the number of the aboriginal inhabitants of the territory mentioned has never at one time exceeded much more than 500,000 of souls. The number of Indians has always been and is now very greatly overrated. This comes from the vanity of the individual Indian, who, if asked about his tribe, will tell you that they are as the leaves on the trees for numbers, and from the interested reports of agents, who dearly like to feed on paper a tribe of 1,000 Indians, but which is actually only 500 or less mouths. All Indians have a strong superstitious repugnance to being counted, and this of late years, that is, since the government has been issuing rations to Indians, is liable to a suspicion of self-interest, the Indians themselves entirely appreciating the advantage of getting from the agent 500 rations for 300 or less mouths. The number of Indians in the United States, exclusive of Alaska, as stated in the last official report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, is in round numbers 253,000. This is probably at least 1/5 too great, but it will be impossible to arrive at the exact population so long as the government makes it to the interest both of the agent and of the Indian to exaggerate their numbers. The Indians have undoubtedly greatly diminished in numbers within the last 50 years. This is not due to unusual wars, nor even to the white man's firewater, as is commonly believed, but principally to those great Indian exterminators, smallpox, measles, and cholera, and to that humane policy of the government which takes Indians from salubrious mountainous regions and settles them on reservations in malarious districts where they are soon decimated by fever and nostalgia. Probably because they live in tents, which are easily and frequently removed, we generally think and speak of Indians as nomads. They are nomadic, but this peculiar life does not prevent their having the strongest possible home attachment and the most ardent love of country. I've already spoken of the wide extent of territory necessary to the comfortable existence of even a small tribe. During the spring, summer, and autumn, the tribe roams at will throughout the whole length and breadth of this territory, wherever it is led by abundance of grass for their ponies, or food for themselves, the camp being changed as frequently as necessity or caprice indicates. Within the limits of their territory, and during the seasons mentioned, Indians are veritable nomads. The winter encampment is regarded by them as permanent, its location not being changed during the whole 3, 4, or 5 months of cold and bad weather. The spot selected for the winter encampment one year may be many miles away from that selected the year before or the year after, but the memory of each is affectionately cherished, especially good and happy encampment not unfrequently giving the name to the year. Outside the limits of their territory, Indians never go, except on war or hunting parties, on rare occasions to pay a visit of ceremony to a neighboring friendly tribe, or on long solitary journeys, as will be described. Within the limits of their territory, they are nomads, but the territory itself is their home. Their attachment to it is one of the strongest traits of their character. No people are more truly lovers of their country. No people suffer more from homesickness when forced to leave it. The mental capacity of the Indian is of superior order. His perceptive faculties are remarkably developed, and his reasoning powers are not to be despised, however crude. He is thoroughly master of all branches of education necessary to the comfort and safety of his savage life, thus giving evidence of capacity for a higher order of education. That he has shown little aptitude for or devotion to the rudiments of our civilized education is due partly to his excitability of temperament and impatience of restraint, and partly to the simple fact that those who had charge of his education cared more for their compensation than for the progress of their pupils, or were impressed with the idea that the necessities of this soul were paramount to those of his intellect. Until very recently, the efforts at Indian education were so ill-directed, so entirely unadapted to the real necessities of the problem as to be absurd. No important question can be decided among Indians without a vast amount of verbiage, and the faculty of speech-making seems to be even more universal among red than white Americans. Every male Indian is his own reporter, his own newspaper. He's expected and required to sound his own praises, and to be modest about it would only redound to his discredit. Knowing that he's obliged to speak in public, he spends no little time not only in the preparation and elaboration of the matter of his speech, but by frequent rehearsal satisfies himself in the manner. Almost every warrior speaks well, some few of them eloquently, but his best efforts are those addressed to his own people when seeking to establish his reputation as a warrior and an orator, or when endeavoring to sway his audience to his own views on some contested point of Indian policy. In his manner and bearing, the Indian is habitually grave and dignified, and in the presence of strangers, he is reserved and silent. These peculiarities have been ascribed by writers on Indian character to stoicism, and the general impression seems to be that the Indian, wrapped in his blanket and impenetrable mystery, and with a face of gloom, stalks through life unmindful of pleasure or pain. Nothing can be farther from the truth. The dignity, reserve, silence are all put on just as a New York swell puts on his swallow-tailed coat and white choker for a dinner party because it's his custom. In his own camp, away from strangers, the Indian is a noisy, jolly, rollicking, mischief-loving braggadocio, brimful of practical jokes and rough fun of any kind, making the welkin ring in with his laughter, and rousing the midnight echoes by song and dance, hoops and yells. He is really as excitable as a Frenchman, and as fond of pleasure as a Sybarite. He will talk himself wild with excitement, vaunting his exploits in love, war, or the chase, and will commit all sorts of extravagances while telling or listening to an exciting story. In their everyday life, Indians are vivacious, chatty, fond of telling and hearing stories. Their nights are often spent in song and dance, and for the number of persons engaged, a permanent Indian camp, safe from all danger of enemies, is at night the noisiest place that can be found. One of the strongest traits of Indian character is curiosity, a positive craving to know all that is going on about him. He must know the meaning of every mark on the ground. He must know all the camp tattle. A stranger arrives in the village and goes into a lodge. In a few moments, half the inhabitants of the village are in or about that lodge, standing on tiptoe, straining eyes and ears, and crowding each other and the stranger, with as little compunction as if the whole thing were a ward primary meeting. Whether or not he evinces surprise at anything depends on his surroundings, and somewhat on the nature of the thing itself. In a formal assemblage, or when in the presence of strangers, it would be the height of bad manners to show surprise, however much he might be feeling it. Uneducated people of our own race feel no surprise at the rising and setting of the sun, the changes of season, the flash of lightning, or the roll of thunder. They accept them as facts, without explanation, and though beyond their comprehension, without surprise. The Indian's endurance of pain and suffering of any and every kind is his patent of manhood. Custom and Indian public opinion have made endurance the exponent of every manly virtue, and he who can subject himself, without a look or expression of pain, to the greatest amount of excruciating torture, is the best man, whatever may be his other qualities. Another most admirable quality he possesses in an eminent degree. This is patience. Endurance and patience would seem to be naturally allied, and to a close observer, they appear to be the warp and woof of Indian character. Every manly quality possessed by the Indian is the outgrowth of one or the other of these traits. His skill and success as warrior, or thief, or hunter, his avoidance of quarrels or conflicts with his associates, his submission to wrongs, outrages, and starvation, all come from his endurance and his patience. Even his disposition to torture his enemies is, to some extent, but the reflex of the conscious pride which would enable him to bear those tortures without flinching. Modesty, as we understand the term, is totally lacking in the Indian character. The chief or warrior who puts a low estimate on his qualities or achievements would be taken at his word and nothing thought of. There are no reporters, no newspapers to herald the praises of a skillful warrior. He must blow his own trumpet, and he does it with magnificent success. Self-praise is no disgrace to him, and half the talk of warriors to each other is made up of exaggerated boasts of what they have done, and most extraordinary assertions as to what they intend to do. The ordinary conversations, at home or in company, are broad even to indecency. In some of the tribes, the women are retiring and modest in manners because custom requires it, but they listen with delight to the storyteller's most filthy recitals and receive with great applause indecent jests and proposals in the sign dance. Clothing is for ornament, not for decency. Ordinarily, even among the wildest tribes, men and women wear some covering, very frequently the men only the breechclout, but I have seen entirely naked men stalking about a village, or joining in a dance, without exciting surprise, comment, or objection from others. Although most gaily bedecked on occasions of ceremony, the ordinary covering of the male Indian is not what would be regarded as decent among civilized people. The women are more decently clothed habitually, but men and women, even young girls, think nothing of bathing together in purus naturalibus, and it is not at all unusual to see boys and girls, even up to 10 years of age, running around the camp in the same condition. There is a curious difference of opinion among writers as to the honesty of the Indian, some asserting that he is an arrant thief, others insisting that he is exceptionally honest. Catlin says that the Indian is honest and honorable, and that he has never stole a shilling's worth of property from him. The fact is that all these authors are both right and wrong. In their own bands, Indians are perfectly honest. In all my intercourse with them, I have heard of not over a half a dozen cases of such theft. It's the sole unpardonable crime among Indians. there being no bolts, no bars, no locks, nor safes, and each Indian having by common custom the right to enter into any lodge of the band at any and at all hours, the property of no one would be safe for a moment, but for the most rigid infliction of the severest punishments on the perpetrator of this solitary Indian crime. The hereditary chief was always recognized, reverenced, and obeyed as sovereign ruler, even though his age or temperament unfitted him for duties in the field. If the acknowledged first warrior of the tribe, the hereditary chief was also the war chief, but if not, a war chief was elected by the council. As his function was only to lead in war, the man of the tribe, chief or warrior, most renowned for his skill and ferocity, was generally selected. In times of peace, he might be little thought of, indeed was oftentimes only hated and feared, and his influence in the council might be of the smallest. But in times of war, he became a power, and his word was law, to which even the hereditary chief might have to submit. In some of the tribes, the war chief and the medicine chief are one and the same person. Perhaps the most famous war chief in history would be Crazy Horse, which is a story for another day. Richard Dodge, 1883.